It is difficult to believe that there was something worse than the Nazi extermination camps, but if there was, we would likely be talking about the massacres committed by the Einsatzgruppen. This was a task force organized by the Nazi security forces, mainly composed of the most sadistic members of the SS, Waffen-SS, and the German police. The Einsatzgruppen etched their name in the darkest pages of history by cold-bloodedly murdering over 1 million people for no reason other than believing themselves superior. In today's video, we will share with you the horrific annihilations committed by this group of Nazis, where and how they occurred, and also explore the repercussions they had at the Nuremberg trials. We warn you that the accounts in this presentation are truly shocking. Welcome once again to Military History. Einsatzgruppen, which in German means operational groups or task forces, was one of the most feared terms for the Jewish community during the height of the Third Reich. These death units were a detachment of the SS and initially operated superficially until they were given clearer directives. They first participated in the annexation of Austria in 1938 and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Later, in a more active and bloodthirsty manner, they operated in Poland in 1939. In all these cases, their function was to carry out tasks indicated by the SS. However, it was not until 1941, during the invasion of the Soviet Union, that they began to operate as true autonomous special units. Let's trace where these deadly squads originated. The Einsatzgruppen were formed under the direction of SS Obergruppenführer Reinhard Heydrich and operated by the Schutzstaffel before and during World War II. Initially, their role was to secure government buildings and documents after the Anschluss in Austria in March 1938, which could be understood as an intelligence service task, initially non-violent. Originally part of the Sicherheitspolizei, or German security police, 2 Einsatzgruppe units were stationed performing tasks in the Sudetenland in October 1938. When military action proved unnecessary due to the Munich agreements, the Einsatzgruppen were assigned to seize government and police documents, secure government buildings, interrogate high-ranking officials, and arrest up to 10,000 Czech communists and German citizens suspected of treason. From September 1939, the general command of the Einsatzgruppen fell under the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Main Security Office, which began assigning them more inhumane and bloodthirsty tasks. In their violent second stage, the Einsatzgruppen began extermination missions, suppressing everything considered undesirable and inferior to Nazism. As part of the campaign to eliminate the so-called undesirable elements of the German population in 1939, these operational groups participated in the sinister Action T4 program. This project involved the coordination of systematic killings carried out by the Nazi regime of individuals with physical and mental disabilities, as well as patients in psychiatric hospitals. Action T4 took place mainly between 1939 and 1941, but it is known that the killings continued until the end of the war. Initially, victims were shot by the Einsatzgruppe, but from the spring of 1940, they implemented other methodologies, such as gas trucks. Next, we will see an explanation of their methods in the Nuremberg trials.
Another form of extermination employed was asphyxiation by lethal gases in enclosed trucks or vans. Here again, the victims were induced to enter these death machines by the promise that they would be transported to other areas for resettlement. As the van left the loading area, it was filled with deadly fumes. A few minutes later, when the van reached the disposal point, the corpses were unloaded into prepared excavations, which became unmarked mass graves. These, then, were the usual methods used by the Einsatzgruppen.
The involvement of the Einsatzgruppen in the inhumane action T4 was just the beginning of a path of death and cruelty rarely seen in human history. Their main task, in the words of SS General Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski at the Nuremberg trials, was the priority killing of Jews, gypsies, and political opponents. According to the records and reports kept by these individuals, they took the lives of 1.5 million people, almost exclusively civilians, without judicial supervision or any legal backing. In clearer terms, it was a cruel and bloodthirsty regiment tasked with murdering those indicated by the high Nazi command, strictly based on racial issues. The Nazis considered Soviet citizens and Jews racially and ideologically inferior, believing them indistinguishable from each other. This was partly due to the prejudice and disdain with which the Nazi regime viewed the communist government system in the Soviet Union, which Hitler and his allies considered dangerous and saw as the main ideological enemy of the fascism they were advancing. That is why the Nazi regime considered communists and Jews as the primary enemies to be stopped and exterminated. In their view, this would allow Germany to win the war and ensure the supremacy of the Aryan race throughout Europe, without the genes and offspring of inferior races interfering in the development of the Nazi racial dream. In response to Adolf Hitler's plan to invade Poland on September 3, 1939, Heydrich reorganized the Einsatzgruppen to travel alongside the German armies during the attack and placed SS Obergruppenführer Werner Best in command. This man appointed Hans-Joachim Tesmer to select personnel for the task forces and their subgroups, called Einsatzkommandos, choosing individuals educated with military experience, but above all with a strong ideological commitment to Nazism. Many members of these forces already had paramilitary experience. Initially, these squads had 2,700 men, but they would soon rise to 4,150 in Poland. Heydrich instructed Wagner to have the Einsatzgruppen carry out their operations in cooperation with the Ordnungspolizei, the public order police, and local military commanders who agreed to collaborate with the Nazis. Despite being a small number, these operational groups were tasked with annihilating all members of the Polish leadership clearly identified with Polish national identity. The Sonderfahndungsbuch Polen, which were lists of people to be exterminated, had been prepared by the SS as early as May 1939, using files compiled by the SD from 1936 onwards. These lists included intellectuals, members of the clergy, teachers, and people belonging to the nobility. In Hitler's own words, not a single Polish leader should remain. Where Polish leaders exist, they must be killed. The Einsatzgruppen carried out the murders of the Polish leadership with the support of the Volksdeutscher Selbstschutz, a paramilitary group formed by ethnic Germans living in Poland who supported Hitler's cause from there. Other collaborators were some members of the SS, the Wehrmacht, and the Ordnungspolizei, who also shot civilians during the Polish campaign. The exact number of the tragedy is unknown, but approximately 65,000 civilians were killed by the end of 1939 in the invasion of Poland. In addition to the leaders of Polish society, they killed Jews, prostitutes, Roma, and mentally ill individuals, ruthlessly pursuing the idea of racial cleansing.
Heinrich Himmler was horrified. He had found it easy to order other people to kill, but to be in the presence of people being shot in large numbers into a pit and to hear their screaming and moaning and see their writhing was more than he could stomach. And he started running around hysterically, screaming, "Kill them quickly, kill them quickly." And this was just about the time when the decision came to move the Jews of Western Europe, which followed directly from the United States joining the war as the result of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. That's when Himmler said, okay, the gloves are off, basically. And they began to think about moving all the Jews of Western Europe.
Before the deadly systematic camps were established, there was much more horror. Although formally under the command of the army, the Einsatzgruppen received their orders from Heydrich and, for the most part, acted independently of the army. Many senior officers of the German armed forces were relieved that these forces took care of genocidal actions, as these murders violated the rules of war established in the Geneva Conventions. However, Hitler had decreed that the army would have to tolerate and even provide logistical support to the Einsatzgruppen when tactically possible. This meant not only that the Führer was aware of the sadistic tasks of these squads, but also encouraged them. Some army commanders complained about unauthorized shootings, looting, and rapes committed by members of the Einsatzgruppen and the Volksdeutscher Selbstschutz, but no high-ranking Nazi official seemed to respond to the complaints. For example, when Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz sent a memorandum complaining to Hitler about the atrocities, the Chancellor dismissed his concerns as childish and cowardly. Not content with humiliating him, the Führer relieved Blaskowitz of his position and put an end to his military career growth. Once the complete invasion of the territory was achieved, the final task of the Einsatzgruppen in Poland was to gather the remaining Jews, those whom they had not killed in a massacre, and concentrate them in ghettos within major cities with railway connections. The ultimate intention was clear: to eliminate all Jews from Poland, but their final fate had not yet been determined or systematized. That would happen later, as described by a specialized historian.
Tenían las manos ocupadas. Estaban tratando a cientos de miles de personas, una bala para cada uno. Había que cavar una fosa común, había que reunir a la gente. Eso costaba tiempo, era un problema. Tenían un grave problema de logística. Así que la Einsatzgruppen terminó precediendo a los campos de concentración. Y en mi opinión, como historiador, que he investigado muy detalladamente los documentos, fueron la razón por la que se inventaron estos campos.
The annihilation of Polish intelligence after the invasion of the country became the first act of the implementation of what would be called Die Endlösung der Judenfrage, in English, the final solution to the Jewish question, in the territories conquered by Nazi Germany. Although it may seem incredible until this moment, the Einsatzgruppen believed they were doing good to humanity because they were dealing with ethnicities they considered subhuman. Moreover, they believed they were morally superior since they showed mercy and only executed the civilian male population with these characteristics. But soon, that dubious humanity would be abandoned altogether in the conquest of Soviet territory. It was already established that the Nazi regime would equate Jews with communists, so the invasion of the Soviet Union was directly an offensive to completely annihilate the enemy. On March 13, 1941, in the period leading up to Operation Barbarossa, Hitler decreed that Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler would receive special tasks by direct orders of the Führer, which he would carry out independently. This directive meant that the Einsatzgruppen were under the control of the sinister Himmler, with an atrocious aggravation. Hitler specified that criminal acts against civilians committed by his troops during the campaign would not be prosecuted in military courts and would, therefore, go unpunished. In other words, there was a green light to kill. All elements were aligned for genocide to be committed, and that was exactly what happened. Most horribly of all, it was carefully prepared. In organizational meetings in June 1941, Himmler described to the top SS leaders the regime's intention to reduce the population of the Soviet Union by 30 million people, not only through the direct murder of those considered racially inferior, but also by depriving the rest of food and other basic needs so that they would perish like animals. The Einsatzgruppen, following the German army into the Soviet Union, were composed of 4 battalion-sized groups of 500 to 900 men each, all ready to exterminate Jews and communists. The 4 main Einsatzgruppen participated in mass shootings from the early days of the invasion of the Soviet Union. Initially, the targets were adult Jewish men, but soon women, children, and the elderly were also included. Initially, attempts were made to justify the killings by alleging false charges against the victims, who were then executed by a firing squad. As this method proved too slow, the Einsatzkommandos began gathering Jews in large groups and shooting them directly into mass graves dug by the victims themselves. Later, a squad officer would machine gun the pile of corpses in case anyone was still alive. Despite this method of mass murder, there were some survivors, and this is one of their testimonies.
Mi padre me abrazó y me puso las manos en la nuca. Las ametralladoras empezaron a... y yo caí. Recuerdo lo que sentí entonces. Mi madre me empujó. Yo caí y él me cayó encima. Creo que me cayó encima. No le vi cayendo, pero estaba encima de mí. Estaba encima, abrazándome y escupiendo sangre. Tras unos segundos, dejó de moverse.
As if ruthlessly executing the entire Jewish community without any compassion were not enough, the Einsatzgruppen used terror as a sadistic tool. In villages, they promoted the idea that the neighbors themselves should collectively murder the Jewish families residing there in organized lynchings, creating a general psychosis against those persecuted by the Nazis. After a while, Himmler realized that the murder methods used by the Einsatzgruppen were inefficient because they were costly and did not kill the victims quickly enough. It was then that one of the most commonly used tools in Action T4 was once again employed, the deadly gas vans. These sinister vehicles began to be used by the main Einsatzgruppen from 1942. However, they were not popular among the Einsatzkommandos because removing the bodies from the van and burying them was a horrifying experience. Prisoners or auxiliaries were often assigned to perform this task to avoid traumatizing the SS men, but the true trauma fell upon the involuntary witnesses of these atrocious massacres.
Lo vi. Vi cómo mataban a niños pequeños. Los mataban sin piedad. Vi con mis propios ojos cómo mataban a un niño. Fue la policía. Le dispararon sin piedad.
Los llevaban a algún sitio y les disparaban hasta la noche.
Luego los tiraban a la fosa, estuvieran vivos o muertos.
Yo volví a casa y vi cómo disparaban a 2 niños cerca de la escuela. Eran niños pequeños. Los pusieron en fila y les dispararon. Uno de ellos tenía incluso un trozo de pan en la mano.
After the end of World War II, 24 high-ranking leaders of the Einsatzgruppen were prosecuted in the Einsatzgruppen trial, part of the subsequent Nuremberg trials. The message from the lead prosecutor, Benjamin Ferencz, was clear and precise.
Reports will show that the slaughter committed by these defendants was dictated not by military necessity, but by that supreme perversion of thought, the Nazi theory of the master race. We shall show that these deeds of men in uniform were the methodical execution of long-range plans to destroy ethnic, national, political, and religious groups which stood condemned in the Nazi mind.
The men of this group were charged with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in the SS. However, 14 death sentences, of which only 4 were carried out, and 2 life sentences were the only verdicts for these hellish squads. Most of the rank-and-file members of the Einsatzgruppen were never formally charged and returned to civilian life as if nothing had happened. In total, the Einsatzgruppen cold-bloodedly murdered over 1.5 million Jews, communists, prisoners of war, and Roma with the greatest imaginable cruelty, all to establish the dominance of a supposed superior race.
J'ai demandé à nos adversaires de mettre fin aux hostilités. J'ai pris cette décision dure au cœur d'un soldat, parce que la situation militaire l'imposait.
The words you just heard horrified millions of inhabitants of Paris in 1940, the year when German flags bearing the infamous eagle of National Socialism began to flutter there. After the surrender, the capital of France became Adolf Hitler's playground. His men turned the City of Lights into a wasteland. The lack of food and fuel led the population into mass exodus, while German soldiers enjoyed ostentatious vacations. In this new installment of military history, we want to take you on a journey into the past, to learn about what life was like on the streets of Paris during the fierce occupation by the Third Reich. In September 1939, France began preparing for battle after the Third Reich invaded Poland, marking the start of World War II. At that time, for Parisians, armed combat seemed distant, thousands of kilometers away. The peace of the City of Lights and its bustling cultural life kept them oblivious to the approaching horror. The problem arose in May 1940, when German troops attacked France and easily defeated its army. The strategy of waiting and defending proved an utter failure, exacerbated by the fact that the army and political sphere were infiltrated by Reich allies.
The Germans continue their relentless advance southward. Considered the best army in the world before May 10th, the French army is now in shambles. And yet it put up a better fight than was thought. In 1 month, 100,000 French soldiers die, the nation's greatest death toll since the same period of time during World War I, the deadliest of wars until then.
The official government fled Paris on June 10th, leaving a void that was filled by Nazism on the 14th of the same month, marking the beginning of a tortuous and humiliating domination of the city. In this context, Philippe Pétain emerged as the local authority, prime minister of the so-called Vichy Republic, an absolute collaborator with Nazi Germany. Within this puppet state, republican institutions and fundamental freedoms were abolished. Additionally, trade unions and political parties were dissolved. Paris was governed by German military and French officials approved by the Third Reich. For Parisians, this period was one of profound anguish. The once vibrant cultural life was replaced by obscurantism and constant control of activities. A curfew was imposed from 9 in the evening until 5 in the morning, during which time the streets were deserted and patrolled only by police and the military. Lights were extinguished, transforming the famous city into a dark and silent wasteland. Simultaneously, France's primary resources were extracted for Germany's benefit. Metals, food, and firearms ended up in the hands of Reich troops. Meanwhile, Parisian citizens endured constant rationing, consuming meager portions of food, wearing the same clothes until they were worn out, and having minimal access to coal and other goods.
When the people of Paris come to the streets again, It is to hear the voice of dictators, telling them what they must do, how they must live, what they must say, what they must think, telling them how to be slaves. Gone is the Republic of France. Gone is free speech and a free representative government. Gone is liberty, equality, fraternity.
Due to the lack of fuel, the number of cars on the streets of Paris decreased from 350,000 before the war to just 4,500 during the occupation. This revived old forms of horse-drawn transportation, such as carts pulled by horses. Trucks and vehicles moving through the city generally ran on low-quality fuel. The metro continued to operate, but with significant interruptions, complicating the daily lives of workers. Hunger and cold were compounded by the necessity of moving around on foot, regardless of the weather. To grasp the chaos caused by the fuel shortage in the transportation system, in 1939, there were 3,500 buses in operation. The following year, only 500 remained in service. The consequences of these issues persisted for several years after the end of World War II.
French civilians, men, women, and children, must slave on farm or in factory for the Nazi master race, or starve. There will be a class of subject alien races. We need not hesitate to call them slaves.
One of the policies that frustrated Parisians the most was the STO program, or compulsory labor service, through which young French people were sent to work in German military factories to produce weaponry and other critical parts. In exchange, French prisoners of war captured during the 1940 advance were returned to the country. Healthy and energetic men left to enslave themselves to ensure the release of sick, hungry, and wounded soldiers. This was crucial in bolstering the ranks of the resistance, as Raymond Aubrac vividly recalls.
Ce qui est très important de noter, c'est l'importance de l'opération STO sur l'opinion publique. Parce que quand on mobilise 3 classes d'âge, toute la population est concernée. Par exemple, les paysans qui ont échappé à une partie des rigueurs de l'occupation, notamment pour les problèmes d'alimentation, et qui n'étaient pas tellement tournés vers la résistance. Le STO les a d'un seul coup basculés, en grande majorité, dans la résistance.
It's important to clarify that the attitude of Parisians towards the occupation varied widely. Some saw the Germans as a source of money, as soldiers arrived eager to spend their wages on entertainment. Later, we'll learn how this drastically and brutally changed the city's cultural life. The response of members of the French Communist Party was more complex, as the party had been denouncing Nazi racist and imperialist policies for years. The problem arose in 1939 with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the fleeting collaboration between Germany and the Soviet Union, putting communist militants in an uncomfortable position. Imagine the confusion of the time when the communist newspaper, L'Humanité, which had been shut down by the French government, received permission to operate from the new Nazi authorities. While many militants continued organizing independently, the French Communist Party remained neutral until 1941. After Operation Barbarossa and the definitive confrontation between Moscow and Berlin, they took a clearly anti-Nazi stance. By the time the Germans reached the capital, part of the population, particularly the wealthier strata, had fled to the countryside and less prominent provinces in hopes of escaping violence. This phenomenon was known as the Exodus of 1940, and thousands of French also crossed into Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. As Nazi domination policies became more aggressive, the poorer sectors decided to leave illegally, risking their lives. Without financial security and facing the uncertainty of homelessness, they fled to other nations. Meanwhile, Jews and other ethnic and religious minorities lived in separate ghettos, enduring daily humiliations by the invading force, legitimized by a collaborationist government. In Paris, Jews were forced to wear the yellow star on their arms, an identifying patch that practically excluded them from any activity on French soil. They were second-class citizens subjected to arbitrary punishments and beatings, not always by the German army, but often by Vichy police officers, the local collaborationist front. Though the Parisian case wasn't as devastating as the Polish one, there were cases of mass deportations in the French capital. For instance, between July 16 and 17, 1942, over 13,000 Jews were arrested by the police on Nazi orders. They were then loaded onto trains and transported to Auschwitz, where many died from execution or starvation. One of the most terrifying aspects of occupied Paris was the sound of sirens signaling raids and the closure of establishments. Those operating them weren't Germans but the French police, which was not friendly to the civilian population. While the French force has tried to cleanse its image regarding collaborationist accusations, it's clear that during the Reich's intervention, they were obedient partners. They conducted arrests and gathered information with violence and mistreatment, especially if there was suspicion of Jewish descent. The Germans lacked sufficient personnel to manage control and activities on French soil, thus local cooperation was crucial to suppress any form of resistance.
This was the price the French were to pay as they signed the armistice. And the master of the master race must go to Paris to tour the streets of what was once the city of light. You notice no cheering crowds here to welcome in the new order.
The invasion was not just military, but also cultural and symbolic. Symbols of Nazism such as eagles or flags with swastikas were placed in every space. Parisian clocks were set to German time to coincide with Berlin time. In every detail, the territory was transformed into a subsidiary zone of Germany. The high military command of the Third Reich moved into the luxurious quarters of the Majestic Hotel on Avenue Kleber. Meanwhile, the military intelligence services were stationed at the Hotel Lutetia. The Luftwaffe, Hitler's Air Force, occupied the legendary Ritz Hotel. The Hotel de la Marine at Place de la Concorde was assigned to the Kriegsmarine, the National Socialist Navy. Thus, every luxury or tourist space became headquarters for the invading force.
For the German soldiers, the year 1940 will be the year of all pleasures. Klaus, the Berlin soldier, finally gets his first leave.
This is Paris, and this is me on the second floor of the Eiffel Tower. We had gone up to the second floor on foot. The elevators were out of order, and it was already very high.
Paris became the favorite vacation destination for German soldiers. Under the slogan, Jeder einmal in Paris, which translates to everyone once in Paris, every German conscript was promised at least one visit to the famous City of Lights. 1 month after the start of the occupation, a bi-monthly magazine was marketed that advertised the most interesting places for National Socialist tourism. This publication included a travel guide and directives on how to interact with locals, permitted areas for movement, and regional authorities that could be contacted. The hotels not occupied by high military command were allocated to accommodate traveling soldiers who took their long-awaited vacations after dedicating their lives to Adolf Hitler's cause. Gradually, the colors red, black, and white took over the French capital, imprinting the cold and austere German style and imposing their diet and customs in the bars. German beer and cuisine became the norm for several years. Regarding entertainment, cinemas became exclusive for permitted citizens or Nazi troops. The programming in these venues changed drastically. Successful French and American films, which had been highly sought after across the continent for years, were no longer screened. Instead, screens were filled with harsh images from German propaganda cinema, characterized by patriotic exaltation and a taste for visual opulence. For centuries, Paris had been a hub for art collecting and housed top-tier museums. The Germans understood the symbolic and monetary value of these treasures, but laws existed regarding the theft of artwork. While most soldiers respected the Hague Convention signed between 1899 and 1907, the Nazi High Command was less considerate. On June 30th, 1940, Adolf Hitler ordered that all artistic pieces in France, whether part of private collections or state-owned, be safeguarded. This led to the emptying of museums and mansions where the wealthiest had safeguarded paintings of immense historical value.
Between 1941 and 1944, 29 convoys left Paris for the Reich. They represented a total of 138 wagons filled with 4,170 boxes. The greatest looting of artworks of all time.
Another aspect of entertainment during the German occupation of Paris was prostitution. Numerous brothels were militarized according to policies set by the National Socialist Party. The official stance of the Reich ensured that its men had guaranteed access to women to prevent any behavior deemed degenerate, particularly homosexuality. They also believed that contact with prostitutes was necessary to ensure the soldiers' performance in battle. The militarization of brothels was one of the darkest aspects of the Nazi presence in the French capital. These establishments operated in former brothels, occupied residences, and even synagogues, symbolizing disdain and humiliation towards Jewish culture and tradition. The women who lived there were often slaves or coerced employees. While they received minimal compensation for their activities, they had no other choice. Refusing to have sex with a German soldier could have deadly consequences for Parisian prostitutes. Unfortunately, after the war ended, civil society's reaction was brutal. Prostitutes who had been with Nazis were considered traitors and publicly humiliated. They were first shaved and had a swastika painted on their foreheads to denounce their crime, a mark of shame visible to all. In many cases, this escalated to physical violence, including lynchings. This post-war brutality is one of the strongest collateral effects of the German occupation in Paris. The City of Lights became, for several years, the lapdog of the German power. Soldiers walked freely, and enemy flags fluttered prominently in every square and monument, which had a significant psychological effect on the people. It was a historical period that required deep analysis to finally incorporate into the consciousness of every French person. Now, it's time to discuss those who disagreed with the collaborationist stance and tried to turn Paris into a beacon of rebellion against fascist advancement.
Like magic, weapons appeared. Under the nose of the Gestapo, they had collected enough to arm 50,000 of their men.
Over time, a portion of Parisians resisted the National Socialist occupation, although their effects were limited. The major achievement of this resistance was keeping the German authorities and the Vichy regime on edge, but the French rebels did not achieve decisive victories. Eventually, the concept of resistance became crucial to the country's history, serving as a way to channel the anguish of being occupied for years by the most brutal totalitarian regime in history. The existence of resistance, no matter how small or fleeting, meant that not all the population accepted the presence of the Third Reich. The first large-scale demonstration against the National Socialist occupation occurred on November 11, 1940, driven by Parisian students. From then on, activities became increasingly dangerous. For instance, in the spring of 1942, 5 students from Lycée Buffon decided to organize a protest against the arrest of one of their teachers. Around 100 classmates participated in the mobilization, and although most managed to escape, the National Socialist intelligence hunted them down. The 5 leaders who spearheaded the event were captured and executed on February 8, 1943.
Like a monstrous beetle from a dark hole in Berlin, this thing marched into the street, the symbol of Nazi power. But Nazi power was in its twilight. On the world's battlefields outside Paris, their beetles were being squashed. Parisians revolted, and the uncanny silences were broken again and again with the whistle of sudden death.
As the war continued and the two fronts, the Allies and the Axis, became more entrenched, various clandestine groups were created in the French capital. Some were loyal to the French Communist Party, others to General Charles de Gaulle, who organized the war response from London. The activities of the groups included attacks on military and police offices, the creation of graffiti alluding to the crimes committed by the Germans, and the demand for the slogan, liberty, equality, and fraternity. The turning point for the German occupation of Paris was the landing of the Allies in Normandy on June 6, 1944. This event allowed the advance of soldiers from the United States and the United Kingdom from the north of the European continent towards the French capital. At the same time, the Germans' control of the City of Lights was increasingly problematic. They no longer had enough personnel to enforce the harsh segregationist laws. Many of the soldiers stationed there had been sent to Italy or the Eastern Front to fight the Soviets. Little by little, the streets of Paris were filled with rebel locals who were in favor of liberation.
A French armored division drives on Paris. This unit of the Allied Army of Invasion has been ordered to battle its way to the capital of France, in which the patriot population has risen against the Nazi garrison. Fierce fighting in Paris, and there are sharp clashes as the rescue force pushes on.
On August 19, 1944, through a popular revolt, the French resistance stormed government buildings and police stations. On the 25th of the same month, Paris was finally liberated by a combination of local and American troops who made way for the arrival of General de Gaulle. It was he who led a triumphal march through the Champs-Élysées on August 26, 1944. Thus, one of the darkest chapters in the history of Paris was closed, although, as we anticipated, the after effects of that traumatic occupation were felt for years. This is how we come to the end of the video. If you liked this content, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.